Welcome to the Neuroveda podcast for complex health. We feature expert guests who dive into ancient and cutting edge understandings of health and disease. These conversations are about food, lifestyle, and medicine, just as much about nature, culture, and politics. I'm Gillian Ehrlich, family nurse practitioner, certified in Ayurveda and functional medicine at our clinic, Neuroveda Health in Seattle, Washington. And I am pretty dang excited. I know I say that every week, but today we have another practitioner from our clinic, Dr. Julianna Giles, and we are going to have a rousing discussion about the immune system from the Ayurvedic perspective and the rest of the world's perspective. And so let me tell you a little bit, remind you a little bit about Dr. Giles. She's a naturopathic physician with a master's in Ayurveda who specializes in integrative oncology, endocrinology, chronic infections, medical cannabis, entheogens, and psychoneuroimmunology. After graduation from Bastyr University, she completed 4 years of residency training in integrative oncology and is in process for FABNO licensing, which is for naturopathic oncology. She's a core lecturer for the Academy of Cannabis Science and a lead formulator for Polite and Lumna, both medical cannabis companies. While at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, she researched medicinal mushrooms and medical cannabis as adjunctive cancer therapies, as well as the neurological effects of mindfulness at the Wisconsin Institute for Sleep and Consciousness. With over 1,008 hours of yoga training, Dr. Giles is certified in Ayurveda yoga therapy, Prana flow, and Kundalini yoga. In her free time, she practices yoga daily, is passionate about plant-based cooking, and loves exploring the wild Pacific Northwest. Dr. Giles, welcome. We're so happy to have you.
Yeah, so glad to be here. I'm really excited for this conversation. It's juicy for us.
It is a very juicy conversation. And so, today's podcast is going to be structured a little bit differently because instead of just kind of interviewing me being an interview and having an interviewee guest, we're going to kind of be doing this more conversationally. So let's get started. Let's dive in and let's talk about, these kind of huge drivers as we think of as as immune dysfunction. And we think about cancer, we think about autoimmune disease. We could also throw chronic infections into this mix like long COVID or Lyme or Epstein-Barr, EBV virus, EBV. So talk to us about what are these at their heart? Like what is cancer? What is autoimmune disease? What are chronic infections? What's going on? Talk to us about that first.
So I'm going to use kind of different terminology. I mean, this is kind of a combination of how Western medicine or conventional medicine thinks of things, but also the way we think about things in Ayurveda, which is a little bit different. What's interesting is that all of these kind of immune mediated illnesses could be called a heterogeneous group of diseases. So autoimmunity is not one disease. Cancer is not one disease. We give them that name because there are specific patterns that are followed, but ultimately, each different type of cancer is its own different disease. Each autoimmune illness is its own type of disease. But there are underlying factors that are at play that are very similar between them, including from the Ayurvedic perspective, a loss of identity or selfness of a single cell. So in cancer, a cell will lose its identity or its selfness and it begins to grow rapidly and out of control, unchecked rapid growth. And then what often happens if it goes untreated is it can spread to other areas of the body, which is metastatic disease. And then that uses up obviously valuable resources, energy resources, et cetera, and will often end in death if the illness is not controlled. So that's particularly with cancer. It's really out of control growth, but it starts with a cell that forgets how to function as it normally should and grows rapidly, or replicates rapidly. So autoimmunity, again, is that same loss of identity or selfness, but instead of rapid out of control growth, those cells begin to attack the body's own healthy tissues, which often leads to progressive degeneration or tissue destruction. And interestingly, there's also a high tendency for what's called antigenic spreading, or the autoimmunity spreading from one organ or one system to another, which is very common. Once one autoimmune illness begins, it's much more common for other autoimmune illnesses to develop in concert with that. And whether or not a particular autoimmune condition is likely to be lethal depends on what the diagnosis is, what the causes are, the tissues involved, how treatable it is, et cetera. So not all autoimmune illnesses will necessarily lead to death, but usually cancers, if left unchecked. And especially if metastatic or spreading to other tissue types, that will eventually, if left unchecked, will lead to death. So they're a little bit different, but they're very similar. Chronic infections can come into play with both of these types of conditions. There are oncogenic infections, including Epstein-Barr virus, that can actually cause cancer in certain tissue types. So that's well established. HPV also causes all sorts of different cancers, we've now realized. And also, chronic infections not only can directly cause cancers, but can lead to immune dysregulation, which can then eventually allow a cancer to develop. Whereas our immune system should come in and check it, kill the cells that are abnormal, and we're fine. That's how the immune system functions all the time. But if it's overburdened or overtaxed with a high infectious burden, somebody has many different rampant viruses in their system, for example, then that can cause immune dysregulation. And while the body is fighting these infections, misses a rogue cancer cell that then begins to proliferate or grow out of control, spread out of control. And with autoimmunity, it's the same thing. There's a lot of different infections that can trigger autoimmunity. It's by a phenomenon called molecular mimicry, where our immune system tries to target a specific antigen on an infectious cell and instead starts to mount an immune response to our healthy cells. And that's a very common cause of autoimmunity. Also, just like with cancers, if somebody's immune system is overburdened with a lot of chronic infections, the immune system is going to have a higher likelihood of being confused or being tied up fighting these infections, and then can also just start to attack its own tissues if there's an underlying genetic predisposition toward autoimmunity. So chronic infections play a big role in immune dysregulation in general and can definitely play a role in both of these types of immune mediated conditions.
Yeah, there's yes, exactly. And so when we think about the analogy that I will often give patients is that you're at the fair and you're playing that game where you've got the gun and the things pop up and you've got to shoot the bad guy with the gun, but you can't shoot the lady with the baby. And here pops up a cow and here pops up something that is a threat. And if all the conditions are perfect, you can very quickly assess and address the guy with a gun versus the lady with the baby. You're shooting one and you're not shooting the other. But if there's like a dog barking at your heels, and if there's somebody singing opera in your ear, and if there's fireworks going off above you, and if your mother-in-law is talking about how could you wear that outfit to the fair, and if there are all these essential distractions, then the intelligence of the shooter, the intelligence of you are acting kind of like an immune system at that point. You're taking care of threats and you're protecting safe tissues. Your intelligence is muddled or lost or erroneous, or the behavior is not accurate. And so you may end up shooting the lady with the baby, which would be autoimmunity, and then not taking care of the guy with the gun, which is essentially cancer. And so what we're doing with the immune system, and it's the one of the things that I say the most about how the Western medicine sees that kind of one of the primary mistakes that we make when we talk about like autoimmunity or cancers is that we think of it as a problem of the tissue. So if you've got Hashimoto's thyroiditis, autoimmune thyroiditis, we think of it as a problem in your thyroid because those are the cells that are essentially attacked. But that's kind of like the lady with the baby that's been shot at unnecessarily to some degree. So it's really the immune system. And when the immune system has backed up and is being confused, it's often confused with multiple tissues, which is why these things will spread. And so while we think of this as a thyroid problem, it really is an immune intelligence disorder. And so that immune intelligence, if we're really going to take care of multiple autoimmune conditions, multiple cancers, multiple viruses, or chronic infections, we really have to look at the intelligence of the immune system. So talk to us about a science that has been up and coming for a number of years, but not that long, that in the Western terminology is called psychoneuroimmunology or psychoneuroimmunoendocrinology or psychoneuroimmunogastroendocrinology. What is
Basically, that's the super jargony medical term for mind-body medicine, really is kind of how it comes it kind that's
Yep.
essentially
Yep.
how the mind and body relate using the nervous system as the bridge. So the nervous system is part of the mind. Ayurveda would argue somewhat against that, but it's definitely involved in the mind and thinking, obviously, cognition, the brain. But in general, something I think that has been overlooked historically, especially in Western or conventional medicine, is how the nervous system really acts as the bridge between the mind and the body and also regulates homeostasis of essentially every tissue and all of the messenger molecules of the body. So that includes the hormonal system. It starts in the brain. That's where all of the control systems are located. And also the immune system. It's really controlled. If you get a fever, that's your brain's response to an infection coming into your body. Your brain is what triggers a fever. So the nervous system really is the master regulator and the bridge between mind and body. But, and again, hormones and the immune system, the endocrine system and the immune system are the two systems that are most affected because of just normal physiology and anatomy. Something that's really interesting and where psychoneuroimmunology in particular comes into play a lot these days is in psychedelic assisted therapies, which are used mainly for trauma that we can think of as being lodged in the nervous system and creating disruption in these axes. So if the trauma is not processed, researchers show that having a lot of adverse childhood events or trauma in childhood is akin to having a traumatic brain injury. I've also seen plenty of patients with actual traumatic brain injuries that have pan-endocrine dysfunction or immune dysregulation because the areas of their brain that were damaged are also the control centers of the immune system and or the hormonal systems. So there's actually physical feedback between the immune system and the brain and the nervous system, and obviously vice versa. And same with the hormones. Obviously, anybody who's ever had a menstrual cycle knows that hormones change our cognition and change the way we think, change our mood, change how we relate to others, etc. So there's no doubt that everything is communicating back and forth. So that's really, and in Ayurveda we call the mind is manas or manovahasrotas, which is separate from the nervous system, which is called majidhatu. But again, they're definitely related and they're linked. Something that I've always loved about Ayurveda in particular is that the sort of channel of the mind is in every cell of the body in the human bodies. The mind is literally every cell is thought of as being part of our mind and giving us constant feedback and processing. And there's consciousness in every cell of the body in Ayurveda, which is very unique. And again, not underappreciated in kind of conventional or Western medicine, but psychoneuroimmunology, psychoneuroendocrinology, that's just kind of a jargony way to bridge that or kind of prove that. And also, something I've always loved about that channel of the mind in Ayurveda is that it includes, it's rooted in the heart. And so that includes where we store and process emotions. So, again, talking about trauma lodging itself in the nervous system and being like a brain injury, it also lodges itself in the mind and causes us to not process emotions. Very frequently, of course, it depends on somebody's constitutional type and life lived experience, but all of that comes into play here. Another interesting sort of parallel between Ayurveda and Western medicine or psychoneuroimmunology is that the immune system really, a lot of the immune system starts in the bone marrow of the body. That's where we produce immune cells in our body. And that's part of Majjadhatu, or what is generally thought of as the nervous system in Ayurveda. So there's a huge overlap in terms of the nervous system and the immune systems and the actual tissue type, according to Ayurveda, which I also find very fascinating because, of course, this is all based on ancient wisdom that is now coming back around and having sort of a mechanism in our current medical model. And then the last thing I would add is that there's something very unique to Ayurveda, which is called Prana, Tejas, and Ojas, which is how we define cellular biology. And again, like you were saying, Jillian, we think of autoimmunity or cancer as a tissue type, but really it starts with a single cell. I said that at the beginning, it's true. There are books about this in cancer, the first cell, because it takes one cell to start replicating out of control to create an illness. It takes one immune cell to attack one healthy tissue type or cell, one healthy cell, to then create tissue destruction that we think of as an autoimmune condition. So the cellular biology in Ayurveda is critical because that's really where most disease arises, is on this at the cellular level. So we call this Prana, Tejas, and Ojas. And Prana is kind of the life force or the cellular vitality or the identity of the cell, according to Ayurveda. Tejas is more of the intelligence of the cell and the cellular metabolism, how, the fire element, how it can burn through things, detox, and create energy, essentially. And then Ojas is cellular immunity and hormones and sort of the life force, the juiciness, the grounding force or the vitality of the cells. So prana is the lightest, and then ojas is the heaviest or the most gross, the most tangible, I guess, of the three. But they all are in dynamic balance and they have to be in dynamic balance. If one goes out of whack, they all go out of whack. You can't just have one be a little bit off. If one's off, they're all off. And that's really where these illnesses begin. And that's where my clinical practice, that's where I focus a lot of energy on healing that layer of kind of the Ayurvedic tissue types or the Ayurvedic cellular biology, because if those are continuing to be out of whack, the nothing is going to be able to heal the immune system, the nervous system, the mind, all of it. Like they have to be in dynamic balance together.
It's so interesting to talk about. I've been thinking about, like, as you've been talking, I've been thinking about how can we make this more real for people, because it's a lot of Sanskrit, which
Right.
you and I adore and feel super like comforted by, I would say. But it really Ayurveda moves from this subtle to this gross level, or from like things that you might think or feel to things that we are and embody. And that's one way to think about both manovahasrotas, which is or manas, which is the mind, the consciousness of every cell, and srotas, the srotansi, are this channel system. And so you are exactly right that there is a mind and a channel for the mind, movement of the mind in every cell in the body. And that the overall picture of manovahasrotas, or the mind, has its root in the heart and its opening or its mouth in the sensory organs, so the places in which we actually interact with the external world. So I don't even know if I should, what I always think about is that book Johnny Got His Gun. Did you remember it? Did you ever read that book? Oh God, it's like a huge anti-war book from the 70s, I think. And it's a slender book. It's horrifying, and it's about a kid in war who ends up having like his face and his arms and his legs blown off, and so he's in a hospital, and it's told from his perspective of laying in a hospital bed, having a clear mind. He's writing this story, but he can't see, he can't speak, he can't, he's got like a feeding tube, so he's not tasting anything, he can't hear anything, he can't see anything, and he can't touch anything, and he can't really move. And about how he lays there for years, and his only sensation is the sun that passes through the window, so his chest will feel warmth at certain parts of the day. And that is the only way that he knows day from night. And that one day a nurse comes in and writes with her finger on his chest, Merry Christmas. And it's like the first time in years that he has any acknowledgement of that an external time zone exists. And so he realizes that he needs to start communicating. And so he starts get the story gets worse. This is such a gross story, but he realized he can communicate, and so he starts communicating with his head, doing Morse code on the pillow, and they think he's having seizures, and they start sedating him. And then at some point there is a contingency of soldiers at his bedside who are giving him like a Purple Heart for his bravery, and it's like they lay the medal on his chest, and he can feel that there's people there, like they're touching his body. And so he starts doing the Morse code again, and one of the soldiers recognizes it, and that's how the communication starts, and that's how he's able essentially to tell the story that becomes this book. I mean, it's not a true story, I don't think, but it's not a true story. But he basically tells the story and says we should not have war because this is the outcome of it. And then they basically like silence him and walk away. But I think about it, but the whole point of Johnny Got His Gun is how important the sensory bodies are, because we really only interact with the outside world through these certain specific cells. It is why in Ayurveda, the doors of perception must be so clear, because they inform our nervous, immune, gastrointestinal, endocrine systems on how to function. If we think a bus is coming for us, or that or that we're going to be attacked by a foreign country, or that certain people are dangerous in our neighborhood. We have a whole rash of responses, cellular responses based on that perception. It's not even an actual experience that our physical body is having, but it starts with perception, right? Our digestive juices start flowing when we think about eating. It's not when the food is there, it's when our mind starts to move. And so the mind in Ayurveda is really rooted in the heart and has its openings in our sensory bodies. So Johnny got his gun. You will never forget how important the sensory mechanisms are. So that's mind, that's manavahasrotas. And then majadatu is really the tissue, right? This is your brain tissue. This is your neuron tissue. And so it doesn't necessarily have, I mean, it has consciousness, but it's the structure, right? And we think about that also, we can make that same translation of subtle to gross, or from perception to material to structure with prana, which we think of as with prana, tejas, and ojas, right? So they're progressively more embodied. And so prana again is that mind. And our teacher, my teacher, Dr. Vasant Lad, used to say, prana is different because it's not just oxygen. Like you can put oxygen into a dead body and it does not become alive. And so it is that, but we do need oxygen to breathe. And so it is that living force, and which is why we talk a lot about prana or chi in Chinese medicine. And so it is this like life force that is very subtle but pervasive, with which we cannot live, without which we cannot live, is this transformative fire, which are enzymes, and it is this intelligence principle. And we see it all over the body in terms of our cells being able to decide, my liver cell, it needs these nutrients out of the bloodstream. It's going to pluck these things out of circulation. It's going to do this metabolism, and it's going to exude these wastes back into the lymph and the vascular system when it's done with them. And that's how that liver cell is embody that tejas, that intelligence. And we see that intelligence operating all over the body at every second of the day, right? So think about how many hundreds of thousands of chemical reactions are happening in every cell, of which there are millions, you know what I mean? And that's not only, and then we have to interact with intelligently with all of the organisms that live in us and on us. So all of our microbiome. So that's another component where we are having to interact with these cells that are not marked Gillian, are not marked Juliana, that they're marked with, whatever organisms, with lactobacillus or bifidobacterium or akkermansia. And so we have this intelligent symbiotic relationship with this entire microbiome. And that's the tejas, is that intelligence piece. And then ojas, this immunity, is like the juice of life. It is the actual like embodiment of immunity. And they talk about there being this kind of like general ojas, which is through every cell. And then Ayurveda talks about these 8 critical drops, which exist in the heart. And that when you lose those 8 critical drops, it is not commensurate with life. And so, I think about ojas as this juiciness, and it's the embodiment of the immunity. It's the actual cells that are going around with the intelligence of tejas and the life force of prana, that together create and direct our immune system to like have this amazing symphony that amazingly keeps us alive against all odds, against all these threats are in our environment. So one way to think about immunity from the Ayurvedic perspective is really like subtle to gross, and kind of then these perceptions of, this life force of prana, this energy, this intelligence of tejas, and this burning of tejas, and then this immunity, it's immunoglobulins. That's like the nature, this like you think of ojas as like fatty and juicy, and like it's like the same with like babies are so fatty and juicy, and have amazing, I mean, you wouldn't think about it with a toddler and their immune system, but think about how many things they come out not knowing, their immune system comes out not knowing, and how much intelligence they take from their environment, and how much immunity they develop over those first 3 to 5 years of life. So talk to us about like what goes wrong in these systems that results in autoimmune disease, cancers, and chronic infections. What goes wrong?
So From the Ayurvedic perspective, it's all essentially starts with disruptions in Prana, Tejas, Ojas. So either again, Prana can also mean cellular respiration, like gas exchange, we require oxygen and we create CO2 as a byproduct. So if there's some sort of loss of either cellular intelligence or respiration, or again that selfness, that can be a foundational sort of hit that can predispose somebody to developing one of these types of illnesses. There's also um, a concept in Ayurveda that is so critical that we just don't have a good name for in Western medicine, which is Tejas burning Ojas. And it happens when there's too much heat in the body, when there's too much sharpness, too much, and that even can be because the immune system is so burdened, the immune system is so ramped up, it's firing all the time with chronic infections or other issues. And so it's so heated up that it basically burns our immune system. It burns our hormonal system. It depletes our hormones. It depletes our immunity. And that causes the prana to kind of go wild because it's very light and subtle. And then you have essentially tissue destruction happening via our own immune system. What I love about the concept of Tejas burning Ojas is that it applies to chronic infections, it applies to autoimmunity or any autoimmune development, it applies to cancer pathogenesis, like it's part of any immune dysregulation. And again, once one is off, it's a domino effect, they're all off. And so that's where it starts at the cellular level. But then in terms of breakdown of communication in the tissues, there's generally always some degree of stagnation, and the stagnation can be because of just too much excess in the system or in a tissue type, or in a channel of the body, or it can be caused by unprocessed, undigested gunk, essentially, which we call ama, which is just waste product that's unprocessed, that's building up. And again, it can build up on a physical level in the actual tissues, like plaquing of the arteries, for example, or it can accumulate in more subtle channels of the body, and it disrupts communication, it disrupts flow, it disrupts the way that cell energy can be produced by the cells, and cell to cell communication can happen, because there's these fundamental channels, whether again physical channels like the vascular system, or these more subtle channels according to Ayurveda. If they're blocked by anything, then there's communication breakdown, and these wastes can accumulate in the actual cell itself, intracellularly, extracellularly, or there's also in Ayurveda we call there's mental ama, or mental unprocessed emotions, unprocessed gunk, unprocessed trauma. Anything that goes unprocessed, including anything mental, is going to show up as essentially gunk or byproduct waste, ama. So again, these can also accumulate in the tissues. And another thing that can happen is the immune system literally, again, we can use plaquing of the arteries as a very tangible example. The immune system, in order to try to break down this gunk, this plaquing, this sludge accumulating in the arteries, the immune system goes in there and tries to break it down. But what does it do? Just creates chronic inflammation and creates more stagnation, because now there's more immune recruitment, there's more calcification, there's more coming to it. And it's actually worsening the problem, although the body is trying to restore function or kill the problem. Same thing can happen with cancer. The immune system gets activated to the tumor bed, and that is a good thing in general, but it can also create more stagnation or more destruction, or it can create, a cytokine storm where the immune system starts to go haywire and proliferate out of control to try to fight this thing. And again, it can happen with infections as well. So regardless, all of these are and there can also be a kind of a deficiency state that causes breakdown of prana, tejas, ojas, or cellular immunity, especially ojas. If somebody's in a chronically depleted state and they're just bottomed out, they're not getting enough sleep, they're not eating enough, they're over exercising, they're in constant fight or flight, it's just going to deplete our reserves of everything. And again, we call that in Ayurveda, we call that ojas, but it's just a depleted state of our tissues, really. And without that, we're losing our protective barriers. Maybe our immunoglobulins go down, or our hormones go down, whatever the case may be. We're in a depleted state, and our defenses are low. And that can be another cause of these situations. But essentially, I would say definitely according to Ayurveda, but also just in my clinical experience more broadly, the things that lead to breakdown of communication or creation of ama in general is poor dietary choices, and that can look very different depending on the person you're talking to, but the wrong food choices or at the wrong times or eaten in the wrong way. Poor lifestyle choices that can include literally anything, including relationships, poor thinking, poor use of the senses, misuse of the sense organs that can cause this kind of accumulation of ama. And then anytime there's poor digestion, and that I don't just mean mouth to anus digestion, although yes, that too, but mental digestion, cellular digestion, digestion and absorption and assimilation of nutrients. If that's not happening properly in uh, anywhere in the body, including at the tissue level or the cellular level, then that's going to cause this toxic accumulation, which is eventually going to cause illness in some form. And that's why we see as we get older, not only aging, which is also an accumulation of AMA or toxicity and a breakdown of metabolism and cellular intelligence, but also accumulation of various chronic illnesses as we get older. Obviously, most children, most infants are not born with a plethora of chronic illnesses, chronic infections, all these diagnoses. Of course, there are fringe cases, but in general, that's not the case. But if you look at somebody who's in their 80s, is even older, they probably have a pretty long laundry list of illnesses. And again, this comes down to all of those accumulations.
And so, how do you, like, when any patient comes to you, let's say with anything in the realm of cancer, autoimmunity, or chronic infections, what is your, like, how do you, what's happening? Like, let's pull back the curtain in the Magic of Oz. Like, how do you think about Prana, Tejas, and Ojas in an individual's case?
I would say it depends on the case, but I either you can, and it depends on how far progressed an illness is and how debilitated a person is as well. Their kind of vitality or vital force. So I will either start going back to kind of the idea of gross versus subtle. I'll either start very much on the gross level, the physical level, and ideally, in an ideal world, we would always start with some sort of clearing the slate, detox, cleaning the system out. And then ideally, again, in a perfect world, rebuilding the system with better building blocks, with healthier cofactors, with all the right things to build healthy tissues back up after clearing out that which has been damaged. Like that's broadly speaking, that's the ideal world. That said, oftentimes by the time people get to me, they're already things are very, very, very out of balance. They're very far down the sort of pathogenesis, whether the Western concept of pathogenesis or the Ayurvedic, it doesn't matter. They're far down it. And so at that point, sometimes it does help to focus on the more subtle because the gross is so overtaken. Like with metastatic illness, if somebody's full of cancer and it's all over the body, the best thing to do rather than trying to put out all of these really big physical fires is to focus on that the more subtle, the cellular intelligence, and help to either remind the immune system what it is and what it needs to be doing, so improving cellular communication between immune cells, improving immune integrity, I guess would be what I would call it. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, different herbs, different a lot of different things that we can do. But fundamentally speaking, at some point, if somebody does have a pretty significant illness, we have to clear out and we have to rebuild. And again, there are lots of different methodologies from lots of different disciplines that we both use in our practice here. So I know that we both share the idea that anything can be medicine, anything can be poison, and anything that works is on the table. We're not biased in terms of like, oh, these therapies are better for some reason. Like whatever works or whatever is appropriate for the person at the time is the ideal. If somebody has a really significant metastatic cancer diagnosis and they're doing immunotherapy, for example, my goal is always to help the immunotherapy work better, but also protect the healthy cells from the effects of the immunotherapy, because immunotherapies can cause secondary autoimmunity. So, how do we improve that immune intelligence so that, yes, it's alerted to the cancer cells and destroys them as the immunotherapy is intended to do, but how do we also protect the healthy cells and not let those cells go wild and out of control and now destroy the organism? And that all comes down to a lot of these more subtle ways of improving Prana, Tejas, and Ojas. And it can be as simple as breath work, which clears the channels and improves cellular respiration, or prana, which is then going to have positive impacts on Tejas and Ojas. Or things to build, if somebody's ojo shy or their ojas is really they're in that super depleted state, we have to build them up first before we can even think about clearing them out. So building, just builders, things to build their immune system, their hormones, their endocrine system, everything, build them back up a little bit, which again will give more reserve or more functioning to prana and tejas. And then from there, eventually detox and rebuild. I would say that's, like, in broad strokes, the bigger goals are always to detox that which is no longer serving the mind, body, spirit, the whole system, and then rebuild it. But often there's other work to do first before somebody's even ready for that.
So if someone was pretty sick and we were wanting to nourish them first, like support Ojas, talk to us about, like, give us kind of 5 examples of things that support healthy Ojas immunity production.
All that which is cool, rich, delicious, yummy, fatty. That's just in essence. So it's going to be things like ghee if somebody is able to consume animal products or dairy. Things like, even I would say even collagen or bone broth, things that are full of immune cells and minerals, highly mineralized. Those are going to improve OJAS. Dates are quintessential for improving OJAS because they're juicy, they're sweet, they're sticky. They're going to essentially build somebody up, and they're full of minerals and vitamins as well. Nuts and seeds, if properly prepared according to Ayurveda. And again, all of this comes down to a person's digestion. So if their digestion is super compromised and they're not digesting something, it's not going to help OJOS. We have to work on that fundamentally first, because these are generally harder things to digest, but they also are very nourishing. So soaked nuts and seeds, or blended nuts and seeds, like with dates or with other herbs and spices. So we love warm OJOS beverages. That's like an almond milk with spices, or something, homemade almond milk with spices and ghee, or and dates, something like that. And whole grains and juicy fruits are also great just builders. So really things that are generally they can be either warm or a little cooling or relatively neutral, but juicy things and things that are full of life too, just so like fresh foods in general too, but definitely those fatty and sweet things in particular, but healthy, not like ice cream or something like that, highly processed things.
So, and easily digested foods like liquid food, like shakes or soups or stews or sweet potatoes. And when you said dates, I was like, "Oh, she's going right for it," because in my mind, the other thing that can really support OJIS is actually like love and connection and massage. And so I was like, "Oh, you're going right for the sex talk, right? Building OJIS."
Yeah, physical you make a great point, the physical touch, warm oil massage, things that we put on our bodies, connection with other people, heart to heart connections, like that builds OJAS. All of these things are critical. And again, and even just connecting with nature, breathing fresh air, being outside, like grounding on the earth, all of these things are critical for us to have that, to be in tune with nature, really, including in ourselves, as within, so without, as without, so within. So all of that is also really critical. Drinking clean water, breathing clean air, eating healthy, real, nourishing foods, resting, sleeping. That's like number one for OJAS. And it's easier said than done. People really struggle with sleep, but if you're not getting good sleep, OJAS is never going to be right, and we're gonna be constantly depleted.
Right. Amazing. So talk to us a little bit about Tejas, kind of like how we see when it's going sideways and what can we do to support healthy Tejas.
Yeah, I love this conversation because Tejas goes hand in hand with mitochondrial function in Western medicine. And obviously, that's getting a lot of PR lately, like mitochondrial health and metabolic illness, metabolic resistance, methylation. All of that comes under the category of Tejas in Ayurveda. So the mitochondria are used, something that I think this is really, really new science, I think like published in the last year. Mitochondria are used to communicate both within the cell and between cells, which is super fascinating. And again, that goes to the intelligence. So if the mitochondria are damaged, and that can come down to some metabolic factors, some sort of toxic factors, some sort of methylation issue, again, toxic accumulations of any kind, inherited genetic issues, all these can cause mitochondrial damage, certain medications, etc. But if they're damaged so within the cell, and intercellular communication, so communication between cells breaks down. So it's the same idea that we've been talking about. Tejas is out of control. Again, it's going to burn Ojas, and that's the initiation of autoimmunity or immune mediated illness in Ayurveda. And again, that means that the cell is burning too hot. The cellular metabolism is going too hard. It's too heated up, whether that be because it's putting out a lot of fires, quite literally, or there are other things like toxic accumulations, heating it up too much, or poor food choices, or environmental toxins, things like that. But essentially, if that Tejas is too hot, or if it's not hot enough, then it's also there will be more toxic accumulation within the cell, which is going to then disrupt intercellular communication as well. So all of that, I think, is only very recently being understood as a huge driver of many common modern illnesses of modern living. Metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure caused by metabolic syndrome. All of these things are Tejas not functioning optimally, cellular metabolism not functioning optimally, and again, impairing the function of Ojas, because even insulin would be part of Ojas. So all of it starts to be related. If the mitochondria are not functioning well, there's not going to be proper cellular respiration or gas exchange, and the cell itself can actually be starved of oxygen and then can live in a sort of half dead, half alive, zombie like state, which is a senescent cell, and just utilize resources but not break, and then cause low grade inflammation in the body. So, all of these things, all of the research now going into mitochondrial disruption, how it affects the nervous system, the immune system, everything, methylation, it really comes down to that Tejas principle in Ayurveda. And again, if that's out of whack, everything in this whole conversation is out of whack, and everything in the cell is out of whack.
And so when we're thinking about treatments to kind of regulate or restore the intelligence of Tejas, we're really looking at all of the treatments that we would use for mitochondrial and metabolic health. So we can kind of, and those are, so even Western medications, things like methylene blue, NAD, metformin, rapamycin, these are all things that are going to restore intelligence and appropriate enzymatic transitions, appropriate targeting of cells, appropriate antibody usage, targeting, it's going to help the thinking, the clarity of that person who's staying there at the fair trying to shoot the guy with the gun and not the lady with the baby. It's that Ojas is the actual mechanism. So it's shooting such a bad analogy because, right, like it hurts a lot of people and we're having some problems with it in our country. But just to say, like, you actually want a functioning gun if you're going to be at the fair and you're going to try for prizes. And so that's the Ojas, is the actual ability to do all of that. The Tejas is to have the thinking to be able to do that. And so those are the treatments. So talk to us about Prana. Like, how do we see Prana? How do we address Prana? What does Prana look like when it's either deficient or erroneous?
Prana that's a huge word in Ayurveda in general, and it can depend on the context what prana really means, but prana really is vitality or life force, and it's synonymous with respiration, and that includes both cellular respiration, so again, oxygen in and then CO2 out, or it can be breathing, like actually breathing. And something that's fascinating about breath work in general, which targets both pranavasrotas, which is the channel, the breathing, the respiratory tract, essentially, the actual respiratory tract, the tissues of it. It is the bridge between that, the Majja Dhatu or the nervous system, and also the mind, the channel of the mind. And so, interestingly, according to Western medicine, the only bridge between the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system is the breath. So, if we're not thinking about it, we're breathing anyway, because the autonomic nervous system takes over and we breathe. But we can also consciously control our breath through the diaphragm, which is a skeletal muscle, meaning it's somatically innervated. And so we can control the breath and then control essentially control the tone of our nervous system through breathing. So the number one way to improve prana in every cell of the body is to breathe and to breathe fully. And again, breathe clean, fresh air, not toxic air filled with heavy metals and filled with asbestos and filled with mold and all of these other things, like breathing clean, real air and doing it intentionally, having the intentionality behind it, any kind of breathing exercise. And it doesn't have to be super huge and fancy and an hour and a half of this sort of like holotropic breath work. Like I'm talking just like take a few deep cleansing breaths, and yes, of course we can go all the way with it and do an hour long of pranayama every morning. I mean, like we can definitely go crazy with it, but just really focusing on breath. And that will innately improve cellular intelligence, improve vitality, will improve cellular respiration, will improve cellular metabolism, digestion, nervous system health, vagal tone. Like, what can't breathwork do, really?
When I went to Ayurveda school back in 2020, a quarter of a century ago, when I first learned this, I did pranayam or Ayurvedic breath work every day for a month. And I was in school. So I was studying a lot. I was actually more sedentary and I lost 5 pounds. And I was so surprised because my weight just rarely changes. And I certainly wasn't eating better and I certainly wasn't more active. And I was really surprised. But that respiration, that metabolism piece can absolutely be corrected. So this has been an amazing conversation. And what I love is how we've been able to look at the immune system from the Ayurvedic perspective, and we've been able to talk about these really complex conditions in ways that are really practical from the Ayurvedic perspective through that lens of prana, tejas, and ojas. So through that lens of vitality, metabolism, and immune structure and capacity. If you are a person who has experienced any of these conditions, or if you know of anybody and they are looking for care, I want to encourage you that through panchakarma, which is the traditional Ayurvedic detox, through plasmapheresis, through stem cell therapy, through IVs, through IVIG, through herbs and body work and meditation and breath work. There are options for you here. This is our approach at Neuroveda Health, and we are available for you. And Dr. Giles is absolutely taking new patients and can see you imminently. Any final thoughts kind of before we close here?
Just that, we always have the power of choice. And I think that's an important thing to end it with, is that no matter how ill a person is or how disabled, we can always use conscious awareness and use our discernment to make different choices. And it doesn't have to be everything overnight, but it can be one thing at a time. And that's what, that intelligent part of us, of every cell of our body, remembering that, just making one different choice, one a month, is going to yield huge positive results. Like, we can do all of this super fancy, big, beautiful, amazing treatments, but it all starts at the foundation, which is food, air, sleep, relationships, sense organs.
Great.
Um, we can always change no matter what.
Awesome. And we love that you've joined us today to discuss how to make our whole world medicine. We rise or fall together and are committed to sharing knowledge and insight that empower us and our communities towards greater health. Thank you for listening to the Neuroveda podcast for complex health. Find out more at neurovedahealth.com, and we'll see you next time.